All right. I am now joined by Harrison Smajovits, who covers the Tampa Bay Lightning for the Hockey Writers, but also is based in Atlanta and covers a lot of Atlanta sports in general. And for those on YouTube, which this should hopefully be there, you could tell he's very invested in Atlanta, so which is good because we want and I wanted to bring on an Atlanta and a perspective on Atlanta for the this expansion relocation conversation and why it would make sense as a market. So first off, Harrison, how you doing? Thank you for joining.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, anytime I get the chance to talk hockey and especially the recent updates related to Atlanta, you have my attention.
Yeah, I mean, it's always great having you on. I'm sure it won't be the last of the season, but we're focused on a topic that is, I think, near and dear to your heart, which is relocation or expansion. It's more relevant that it's expansion now because now that they've figured out the NHL's figured out the Arizona sort of mess and have a team in Utah, that's out of the way. Now it's a matter of going to 33 and then going from 33 to 34 teams in the NHL. And Atlanta's one of the cities on their list. And I'll just start, which is why do you think Atlanta has a great case to have first of all third time's a charm slash the third go around here for an NHL team.
So there's two ways I'm going to go about it. One, I'm going to talk about the city itself, and then one, I'm going to talk about like the potential groups who would be running the team. So the first one has to do with the fact that just Atlanta is one of the largest cities in the United States. It's, I believe, the sixth largest metro market. And just based on size alone, it's definitely just worth it for the NHL just to give it a shot. It's one of the reasons they're even hearing out options to begin with. And there is a hockey presence here. Like you go up to Gas South Arena, go see the Gladiators. They're one of the most attended ECHL teams in that specific league. But obviously, it's a bit different. You only need 7,000 fans a game for them versus 17. Well, not 70. That's a low number. These. Let's say about 18,000 for an NHL attendance number at minimum. But so you look at what could potentially be here, along with the size of the markets. That's the case for Atlanta in particular. One of the big reasons just for this specific group coming in, they have a full plan, it seems like. I know the NHL has said they're waiting for like a full proposal. That happened about 4 weeks ago, I believe. But they have these developments, expansion fee numbers are out there. They've talked about their plans for growing the sport more in the state of Georgia. This is specifically information based on the Vernon Krause group. I know there's a group with like Anson Carter that's involved, but there's not as much information about them outside of like the developments itself. The Krause group has been way more active. They've gotten way more interviews, put information out there. If In my personal opinion, I feel like they would be the favorite of the two to get the expansion team if it were to happen. And just based on all the information out there with them, it's like ownership was a big reason why the team that's in the background for this video is no longer here. A lot of times they'll say, oh, yeah, well, Atlanta's just not a hockey market. Well, in the first few years the Thrashers were around, attendance was pretty good, but when the product's not always there, there's indifference from ownership, it creates apathy for the fan base. And if you have an owner like this one, like with Kraus, who seems very passionate about the sports, he's funding junior teams to go up to Quebec and compete. There's a chance that it helps just create more excitement beyond just that brief honeymoon phase and create something sustainable.
Yeah, I mean the big thing is you talk about the ownership. You talk about the Atlanta Thrashers why they failed, and it's also not just the Atlanta Thrashers, but the Atlanta Flames back in the 70s where they did not have competent ownership in place, and that's why you look at why it failed, and that's why it eventually teams in other markets were like, well, we have an ownership group in place, and that's the big question is there that now? I mean, that's the I mean, we don't really know until it happens. You're kind of alluding to it that there's ownership groups interested, but is there one that you could confidently say is in place that okay, they're willing to spend? I mean, the interesting thing is that you look at some of the other teams in the area, like Turner owns TNT, and they own the baseball team, and Arthur Blank, who owns Home Depot, owns owns the Atlanta Falcons. And it doesn't seem like either of them are interested in bringing a hockey team unless there's something that maybe they're behind the scenes secretly want a team there. But is there that ownership group? You kind of touched on it, but is there one that you confidently say will be able to kick off the ground running the third time around?
I would definitely say it's the Kraus group, just because of their want to have everything from the ground up grassroots campaign. And look, there might be just be some bias there just because of the more exposure he has gotten. Like, I don't want to sound like the group that has Carter couldn't do it. But again, I can only work with the information that's been put out there publicly. And right now, it just seems, at least from how they break things down, how they talk about things in interviews, and, it's more than just like, we have this cool idea. Like, there's at least for them bullet point plans. Like, is there a full proposal that the NHL has received yet? No. But just from the information they put out there, there's at least a vote of confidence. And it's why the league has not elite. And remember, this is a key thing. They haven't said no yet. More information keeps coming out that has not led to a yes yet, but there's got to be some level of confidence in at least one of these groups if the whole concept hasn't been shut down entirely.
Well, for sure that you talk about the Kraus group, and it kind of reminds me of the way Utah got a team. Is that you heard early on Ryan Smith, who now owns the team, was interested and vocally interested, saying, "I want to do whatever it takes to get a team to Utah." And it actually happened to be that the way things unfolded, he got one, and he was willing to spend to do it. So it seems like that's what's early on the indications are for them, and that's the exciting part, I think, for Atlanta early on. One of the interesting things also is I wonder about this because there used to be hockey there, but is there an arena in place? I think that's a big thing because the NHL, I think right now is kind of like looking at markets, seeing how many check off the boxes, and then saying, all right, these ones work, these ones don't, these don't. And one of the big ones is there an arena in place, slash, is there a plan to build one? Because a lot of teams will say, well, they have one, they have a basketball team there. Houston, for example, has a basketball team there, and Utah had the Delta Center, I believe it's still called that, but they had the basketball arena there, but building on top of the basketball arena a hockey rink, it's a lot harder than people think. So I wonder, and it can interfere with all the sight lines and all the other issues that come up with putting a hockey rink on top of basketball. The other way around is a little easier. So wonder, is there an arena in place in Atlanta, slash, are they building one? And what the other layer to this is what type of arena makes sense? Because I think when it comes to football versus baseball, one's in downtown versus one's in the suburban area. What do you think makes sense with all this? Because are you looking to build around the suburban fan base, or you're looking to build around downtown, let's say? What's going on with the overall arena plan, if they're like, or what do you think is going on, or what can happen with that?
So there are two answers to this question. The first one is currently available. There is temporary options. When it comes to full-time, there are at least plans and developments in place, and that also translates to the vote of confidence question you asked earlier. So when it comes, just first we'll talk the temporary stuff. So if you ask some locals, they might just say, "Oh yeah, you can go to Gas South Arena, which is in Duluth, Gwinnett County. I think it's at least in Duluth. I believe it's in Gwinnett County." And then you have it where it's like they can just play there because that's where the Gladiators play. And then you realize it's probably not big enough. I think at most it holds 10,000 people,
And
which,
I mean, to add to that, like the NHL's gone through this already with Arizona.
yes,
They
with
do not
Muller.
want to. They do not want to rerun where, all right, we have a temporary plan, and then that temporary plan becomes a little more permanent. They don't want to go through that mess again. I feel like they need to see an arena to believe it. So, but just sorry, go
No,
ahead. But I'm
I'm
just saying,
glad
like,
you brought that up because it's a very valid point. Because the point I was going to bring up is like in the past they've done other temporary arenas. So like for context, I'm from the Tampa Bay area, which is how I ended up covering the Lightning, and their first ever arena was expo hall on the fairgrounds, which holds about 10,000 people. But that was in the early 90s. Standards were different. They were going to quickly move into a baseball stadium for a few years that held over 20, that could fit, 40,000 people, and then move into the Ice Palace, which is now Benchmark International Arena. But for a temporary option in Atlanta, the more realistic one would be State Farm Arena downtown, which used to be Phillips Arena where the Thrashers play. It's not viable long term, one, because they've renovated the arena since then. There's not really good sight lines for that arena anymore for hockey.
It's the
And
basketball arena, just to
the
confirm.
basketball, yeah, where the Hawks play, yes.
Yeah.
And there are developments in the reason they want to do downtown is because a lot of teams have been leaving downtown. The biggest example being the Atlanta Braves. They've left Turner Field to move to Truist Park up in Marietta. And the development plans for this NHL team are all in the suburbs, north of the city. The Kraus one, for example, would be what's called I'm forgetting the exact name, but it's in South Forsyth. The Gathering of South Forsyth. It came back to me right there. And the whole idea would be basically copy paste what the Battery is for the Braves, and you put it a little bit north, I believe, of Alpharetta. And it would be a whole development around the hockey arena, brings people there to hang out, even if it's not just for the game. And it helps create a whole experience that helps make the team more profitable. There's renderings online. It's a little over 18,000 seats, I believe, would be in the arena. So it would, and the funding for it is in place. Like they got county approval, and a lot of them, in the way it's currently set up is the second the expansion team is awarded, the funding will activate. I don't have the exact number. I don't want to throw one out there because I could be completely wrong. It's been a while since I've checked it. I should have before I came on here. But
This is very long.
there is public funding in place that is agreed upon that when the expansion team comes in, they get the money, they get to start building, and it all that part is at least in place. And that also helps with the confidence, and what probably helps build confidence for the NHL is funding is taken care of, designs for arenas are there, and that already helps get past some major hurdles that keep them out of the cycle of potentially being stuck in the potential turn forever option.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the interesting thing you mentioned the public funding. I think that's an interesting thing because one of the things that I think the common belief around the NHL expansion is they're going to look at a city. They're going to look at try to put a team in downtown. And I think Florida, for example, the Panthers, they've proven, and I'm repeating myself because definitely on the previous recordings we've talked about Florida being a team that they aren't in the city. They're in Sunrise and they cater to a suburban fan base. I think, and the interesting thing is a lot of these teams are looking at when you look at building an arena, and also if you want to build an arena, you want to build a whether it's a fan area or just an overall downtown, an overall atmosphere surrounded by the team. The cities don't want to put that money into. I mean, it makes sense because it sometimes it costs the city a lot of money and it's doesn't really help the city itself, helps the team. So putting it in a suburban area does matter a lot, and it's interesting because I think this is one of those situations where I think because of all these things, Atlanta could be the team that if the NHL gets to 33, they'll be the 34th. Where you see the progress there, you see the arena being developed and built, knowing they're going to be 34, or knowing they're like similar with Vegas and Seattle, where Vegas came in and then Seattle got a team. Where I think that's something interesting to probably monitor. I wonder. We're talking about the logistics or the off the ice part. An on ice thing, and this is what I think is interesting, is does can Atlanta survive if they're an average team? I think this is a very important thing because I think when you look at Atlanta in the past, if the Thrashers weren't good, there was a lot of disinterest. And this is something because the market, baseball is big there, football is big there, not just NFL football, but you've got college football there. And this is something I think the NFL, I mean, the NHL, I'm mixing up my leagues now, but the NHL is going to say this is a red flag where if there's a 500 team there, a team that's not that good, that there's not going to be interest when the season starts, especially if you have those teams that are competing for championships in the other sports, that fans are just going to be like, we're following that. all of a sudden it's January or February, and it's like, oh, now we're getting into hockey. So do you think Atlanta can survive with a 500 team? And this is particularly could be an issue if they're an expansion franchise where they're not Vegas and they're not kicking off the ground running.
I think at least in the early years, the answer is yes. And I think long term is one of those that we just unfortunately have to figure out. I think what would just help is I think location will help make a difference, which probably played a role with the Thrashers in the past. You even just saw with the Braves. Even when they weren't doing as well, their attendance took a bit of a hit at Turner Field. They move up into the suburbs, the arena, or not the arena, sorry, the new ballpark, and attendance, even when they're still not very good, went up. Yes, I know there is a honeymoon phase there, but there is some statistic to roll with here. So I think that will
Well,
at least help if
you
I
bring
think
up a good point because I would say compare Atlanta to Houston, where in Houston, when the baseball or football team are average, the attendance plummets. I mean, you could look at the Houston Astros, who've won World Series in recent years, had very poor attendance recently, and they were a good team this year. But compare it to Atlanta, where even the teams that weren't good this year, and I think there were a few of them in the city, they still sold pretty well. I'm sorry if I'm cutting you off there, but I feel like that's a case for them. I wonder though if the hockey team will have a similar effect. I mean, it sounds like it could.
no, absolutely. And I think having it in locations that even if the team isn't necessarily good, but you have them within a reasonable distance of the population that wants to see hockey, you're in a good spot to at least still get solid attendance numbers. And in the end, like I tend to stand by the belief that as long as a team is watchable and there is something to tune in for, it will at least maintain interest. Obviously, if you're a team at the top of the standings, you're always going to do a lot better. But I think a combination of arena location and just overall watchability of the product is the two things that will come into play here. I mean, if they're absolute cellar dwellers, then you have a problem. But if you're 500 like you're asking, I think that plus location can be good enough to help with sustainability.
Well, for sure, yeah. The winning, I mean, winning is obviously the most important part to it. But I mean, yeah, again, if they're an expansion team and they don't draft like Vegas, who won the lottery, which is appropriate for Vegas for the slot machines or whatever that's going on there. But they won the lottery, but they're an expansion team. Seattle did not have a good expansion draft. There's a chance, again, most likely that they're a 500 team to start. If Atlanta gets a team, a 500 team, and maybe they don't have that superstar. Maybe they draft one, but let's say they don't get a superstar from expansion team in an expansion draft, like Marc-Andre Fleury, who you could say is that superstar type of player, but they don't get that, and it's hard to sell the on ice product. I think an interesting part to this also is you need an ownership group that can say we're going to get fans in, whether it's with but we're going to cater to our audience. And if you mention it's a suburban team, part of that would be, I think, selling to family audiences, which I think you look at Florida, that's really what they do is they sell to a family type of audience versus a corporate audience or a city audience, which is more like one or two fans, but you're selling those type of games or those type whether you sell packages or the promos that you're giving out, those type of things are I think very important to the success for them. And that's going to be interesting. I think like the owner that has that plan has that in mind. I think we'll find it's one of those we'll only find out when it happens. Uh, to shift gears a bit, one of the interesting things that I think is interesting about these cities and something that we kind of overlook, but I think is going to be important, is having an AHL team also in place. Because one of the big things that I mentioned this already on the previous recordings is with the new rules in place, if a player gets called up or down to the AHL or NHL, they have to play at least one game before getting sent back down. And with that rule in mind, a lot of teams are going to want their affiliates close by. Even teams that, let's say, you look at Charlotte, maybe Florida would want to move a team close by because Charlotte is even further, but you want to have a team close by an affiliate so that you don't have to worry about all that travel. And the other layer to it is you need to be in a city that's very connectable with airports, airport hub, which Atlanta is. So you don't have to worry about that. That's a big plus for Atlanta is that they have an airport hub, which is a big bonus for them. But if they get an AHL team, where could I actually would ask you that? Where do you see if they had an affiliate? Where would they potentially go? There's some big cities that are nearby, like Jacksonville or Orlando or even Charlotte. Let's say Florida moves their affiliate closer, they can move into Charlotte. But where do you think what do you see the AHL? And then to add on to that, the ECHL affiliate, how do you see that stacking up for a team, especially they're going to want it close by?
Well, the ECHL one's the easiest answer because I know right now the Gladiators, I believe, are the Nashville affiliates. They can make a switch. You get the let's just call them the Thrashers 2.0 for now, affiliated with the Gladiators. You have it in north of Atlanta, the same way the Braves have the Gwinnett Stripers of AAA, like within their metro area. So, and that's without, potentially promoting them to the AHL, keeping them in the ECHL. That's probably the quickest one. When it comes to the AHL, unless they want to, find a way to get a team in Charlotte, which is not that, probably one of the more closer major cities. You'd have to see, like, do you put a team somewhere else in what I call, I'm just for the sake of it, Braves country? Like, do you have an AHL team somewhere established, maybe in like South Carolina, or do you put one somewhere in like Alabama or somewhere else in Tennessee? Obviously, there's the Nashville Predators already in Nashville, but do you do something like Memphis or Knoxville, like something that is like large enough to support an AHL level team?
It's interesting that I mean, I feel like Nashville, Tennessee's like, it feels like a little bit, it's almost like that's a
It's almost
no for,
you're entering intrusive area, I feel like, with Tennessee. The more we
yeah,
talk
it
about
feels
it.
like that's like a no because that's where the Predators are, and it just seems like that's their territory. But it's interesting because you mentioned Alabama, you mentioned South Carolina, and the big thing for them is that you don't. I mean, that's the other part to this is that you don't have an airport hub there. Or Orlando for me makes a lot of sense. Whether it's them or whether it's, let's say, the Tampa Bay Lightning would move their affiliate there, and then another city opens up for them. But Orlando makes a lot of sense for an AHL team. Jacksonville, I don't. I think they have an airport hub. I think they're at least very connectable in terms of,
They have a big enough one.
yeah,
Okay.
they're connectable enough, so they make a lot of sense for that. Uh, if they don't, and let's say they want to have one in their backyard, you probably could look at maybe Savannah, which Savannah also has an ECHL team. I know that because one of the hockey writers, Sylvie McCarthy, is actually
Ghost
covering,
Pirates.
yeah, the Savannah Ghost Pirates. So that's one to keep in mind if they want it like right next to them. Although Savannah's not right next to them, but it's close enough. So it is interesting because I think having that in place saves the NHL a headache, and I think it's going to be it's interesting because like one of the NHL right now I think is going through a checklist and they want to see, okay, do they have this, do they have that? And I think for Atlanta, for example, do they have an airport hub? Check. Yes, we don't have to worry about that. Do they have a big population? Check. I actually have like my list. I went through it with the Houston group as well, which is all the things I think the NHL is looking at, which is, do you have the population? Check. Do you have the infrastructure? I think Atlanta, you're wondering, you have it, but you don't know if the arena's there yet. So that's a maybe right now, where you're checking off this list. Great ownership, which sounds like there's at least an ownership group ready to be in place. Hockey history, they have that. And then the other two ones, which we kind of touched on, which are, I mean, we said airport hub, but the other teams in the area and whether that helps or hurts them. I kind of just went through that list. Is there anything that stands out to you when I listed all those things, or is there anything that you kind of disagree with, push back on, saying like, okay, maybe that's not something on the NHL's list, or how you see Atlanta maybe playing into some of those things that I just like rattled off?
Like when it comes to the affiliates.
Well, no, like some of the checklist things that you're, I'd say, like the infrastructure for hockey. I mean, some of these keys, like how many Atlanta really has, and if you push back and say like the NHL doesn't, Atlanta doesn't need that to succeed. If you or any city for that matter, like ownership group, hockey history. Well, Atlanta has that. Or the infrastructure in place, which it sounds like they do have. Although through our discussions, it seems like there's some stuff that you still don't know about.
Yeah, there's a lot of unknowns just right now. I think, and I'd make the argument that if you go from the history routes, just that might hurt Atlanta's chances because
Yeah.
the Flames are now in Calgary and the Thrashers are now in Winnipeg. But definitely infrastructure doesn't seem to be a concern. Ownership capabilities, desires, obviously it's all different once you execute versus describing your vision, and you have to state that fact because that is just how it is. We don't know how they'll actually execute it once the time comes. But I think those are just major boxes they have checked off. As for like other markets, yeah, I'm sure Atlanta has Lightning and Hurricanes fans and Predators fans. They're all in a reasonable distance. If you turn on, uh, what I guess is now the FanDuel Sports Network, you'll get both Predators and Hurricanes games in Atlanta because those are like part of their geographical markets. But I think in the end, like a lot of people, if Thrashers 2.0 comes to town, a lot of them are going to switch, or maybe they'll have their two teams, and maybe they'll prioritize when certain teams come to town. That's not necessarily the strongest way to bring people in, but that you could think of it also from you have local rivalries that could be beneficial to this team. I know Nashville's in the Western Conference, and while Carolina's in the East, but just from a geographical standpoint, there's something there with that. And I think that at least helps build interest because then you have more than just, hoping the Thrashers can latch on to the Bruins the way the Lightning did to build a rivalry there. Because, it took a while for the Panthers and the Lightning to actually have something. So they had to go up north. And I think with, Carolina being a good team, the Predators typically being a contender. I know right now they're kind of wishy-washy, but just with the local options, I think that only helps them, I think.
And it's interesting. You're talking about the local options and the other teams, and what kind of fans will be in the area. I actually am curious about this because I feel like this is an issue for some other markets that the NHL is looking at. Is Atlanta a transient type of town, or is it more of because are people moving in from other areas, which can be good and bad? I think the negative to that, which I think you've actually seen when the Florida teams weren't good, Chicago came to town. It was a Chicago home game. Montreal came to town. It was a Montreal home game. And I wonder, I actually don't know the Atlantic demographics off the top of my head, but is that something slash if it's not a transient town, is that something that probably helps their case? But I don't know. You tell me what it kind of is like.
The best way to describe it is like it is and it isn't because you have a lot of people who do move to Atlanta from other places, but you also have a lot of people who are born and raised here in the Atlanta area and their family's been here for generations. It's not like, for example, where I am from Florida, where everyone and their mom is from Michigan, and maybe a handful of people have been there for generations. In places like Atlanta, you have that. Um, Local generations back population, but then you also have people just moving from other places and probably from other hockey markets that just help, boost that interest. You have that mix of people from other markets, which will mean there are away fans in the crowd, but also it means if that team's not in town, there is an NHL team to latch onto for every other game. Because you do have a lot of people where they might be per se Black Sox fans, but they also root for the team that's in the city they live in. And then you have those who are just like, well, I'm from Atlanta. I root for Atlanta teams. There's now an Atlanta NHL team. Let's give this a shot.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing is that I think what's interesting about Atlanta for that matter as well is that a team that is marketing they can really say like they probably would even call themselves the Georgia team because they want to probably kind of similar with Salt Lake City where they call themselves Utah.
Yeah. And
They don't
actually,
call themselves Salt Lake.
I'm glad you brought that up because if I recall correctly in an interview with Kraus, he said he was interested in doing a Georgia moniker as opposed to Atlanta just to change things up a little bit from the first two Atlanta teams. And it's not a bad idea because you get, like you mentioned, the idea of you represent not just Atlanta, but the states.
Yeah. And you're merely marketing that. Let's wrap up with running low on time, but let's wrap up with this question of we're talking about what can make it successful. I'm wondering what can make Atlanta a destination, a place where players want to go, and it's a sleeping giant type of team where we talk about them the way we talk about Florida, we talk about Dallas, we talk about Vegas. I mean, we're mentioning all these teams, but these teams that are winning all the time, that they are a destination that they want to they want to play for. I mean, I'll throw in two things that we kind of we didn't touch up on, we didn't talk about enough. I mentioned the state of Georgia, where you become like, again, you're part of that bigger regional team, not just a city team, but also another bonus is you do have the corporate backing, which we mentioned Kraus ownership, but you do have some big businesses there, big things that can really you can really get the most out of. You have Coca-Cola, Home Depot, stuff like that that are there. But what do you think can turn Atlanta into a destination?
So there's a couple that immediately went off the top of my head. One, that Atlanta's already just a big city with places with like things to do. There are all kinds of options, whether it's just for locals or tourists. You know, you go in, you knock out the things in downtown Atlanta, whether it's the Coke Museum and the aquarium. But like if you're a young hockey player, there are things to do when you're not or in the off season, like in Midtown or Virginia Highlands. Like there's just places to go for young players to hang out, be with their friends. It's uh it's a young man's city for sure, but it's also a place that's good for families. So you got to think from that personal perspective. And um, income tax is not one of those incentives like they always talk about with the state of Florida. I know I pay it. But you have it where like weather is still pretty good in Georgia for the most part. It snows maybe once every decade. Like it snowed last winter, but this time around it's probably not going to. So you already have much milder weather. And I'd say only about for like a month a year you really have to deal with anything extreme. And besides that, it's a very weather is pretty good here. And I think that would help bring some guys in instead of like, why go to the Northeast where it's cold for half the year? Instead, you can come to Georgia and maybe deal with a bit of a lower cost of living still. And that's just an attractive thing from that perspective.
The big thing when you mention weather and you mention the southern areas is the big thing that every city likes mentioning is that you have golf. And if hockey players love anything, they love to play golf when they're not playing hockey. So there's every market's going to have their advantages and disadvantages. And I think Atlanta has a lot working in its favor. It has a lot of questions still. It still has a lot of unresolved stuff, but stuff that you have to figure out slash stuff that's still in the works. At the same time, there is a belief that maybe third time's a charm is going to actually work this time, especially if they have competent ownership in place. All right, Harrison. Thank you for joining. It was really great talking about really diving into this. Anything you're working on that we could plug now? Any articles, maybe stuff about Atlanta, maybe stuff now Atlanta's going to be on your mind, maybe to write an article about it. But anything hockey related that you've got in the works that we should know about?
Nothing about Atlanta specifically at this time, but check out the hockey writers. If there's any major Atlanta news, there's usually me taking the chance to jump on it like I have a couple of times before, and I look forward to doing it again.
There's always whenever news breaks, and there's plenty of it, there's stuff there. But also check out all of Harrison's great work on the Tampa Bay Lightning. He's still covering them until an Atlanta team comes in. Probably still will cover the Tampa Bay Lightning. I think that's where your roots are, and they're still one of the interesting teams in the NHL, and the season's around the corner. So by the time you listen to this, season might have already started. So uh, all great stuff. Yeah, really exciting to pay attention to. All right, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back.